Hello friends and comrades, and welcome back again to the MCP channel. Now today I wanted to talk about a topic of critical importance to all of those who are interested in the history of Maoist China and in defending it, and that is the topic, of course, of the Cultural Revolution. Now, if you live in the West or even in modern China, you will hear a lot of negativity about the Cultural Revolution, and you'll get a lot of these university intellectuals, and if you read Scar literature or watch the Scar movies, it's just portrayed as an absolute hell with fanatics beating everyone up in the country in a near civil war. So what I wanted to explore today is not a denial of such fanaticism or a particular look at these cases specifically, but what I wanted to do is see whether these events, if we can condemn them, does that mean we are condemning the Cultural Revolution, or is there something else essential about the Cultural Revolution that defines it aside from this fanaticism? So I wanted to look at what the Cultural Revolution was intended to be, what other things it was apart from these acts of violence in the cities, and what would happen if we didn't have it. And of course we can have a good idea of what that would look like because it was cancelled after the death of Chairman Mao. So let's look at the idea of a Cultural Revolution to begin with. So the idea of a Cultural Revolution is not just to destroy anything that is old, as is commonly thought. People think it's just to destroy every historical artifact, every building, every old manuscript, to destroy all of China's traditional cultural practices, to get rid of kung fu, to get rid of tea ceremony, to get rid of calligraphy, and that's not the case. Now, a lot of these things were imbued with a proletarian culture, so they were sublated. They continued in a new form, which served as part of a superstructure to serve the proletariat and maintain the legitimacy of a proletarian state rather than the one of a former mode of production. But back to the idea of the Cultural Revolution, it was supposed to be a targeted attack against specific elements of the culture that was used as part of the superstructure to support a restoration of capitalism, and it was a struggle of the masses against revisionism in the party. Now, China's Cultural Revolution did of course see fanatics who did many unjust things, and opportunists taking advantage of a power that was up for grabs. Especially in the first 2 years, things were pretty violent. It was a revolution after all, and to be honest, as far as revolutions go, it was fairly peaceful. These acts of violence or fanaticism did not have Mao's blessing, or however we might say, as it is often portrayed in the media. Interestingly, many of the fanatical groups persecuting intellectuals, clergy and such, which we condemn, were led by Liu Shaoqi. Mao and Zhou Enlai even issued orders to protect historical sites. Eventually, Mao had the army sent in to rein in this kind of behaviour, ensure order and guide the course of the Cultural Revolution. When Mao thought the over-socialised urbanite Red Guards were becoming too disconnected, he implemented a programme which mandated all students must complete at least 3 years of labour in the countryside or in a factory in order to understand the material situation of the country and not to become revisionist. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of focus on these abuses in the cities, but the fact is, at this time, the vast majority of China's population were not in the cities, they were peasants in the countryside. So this is, of course, where the majority of the Cultural Revolution occurred, and where the majority of the achievements of the Cultural Revolution occurred. In the countryside, the significance of the Cultural Revolution was that it empowered the masses to challenge their local party officials in the name of Mao, and it meant that the two Huangdi couldn't associate their personal power with the power of the party and accuse those who were criticising their personal misdealings as being against the party and being counter-revolutionaries, as they were doing before. It also eliminated the deeply corrupt bureaucracy which had lied about production figures in the Great Leap Forwards for personal gain, causing what should have been like 10% grain taxes in some areas to be almost everything a village had produced, because they'd sent in figures that were much higher, and then they had to send off almost everything they'd produced to the central government. Of course, these areas also didn't receive extra rations in the system to alleviate the famine, because the government believed that they had high production figures and they still had 90% of that grain left, or what have you. The Cultural Revolution also saw the construction of many schools, the eradication of competitiveness, and exams in schools, or any exams that remained were open book, and also the expansion of healthcare to rural areas, a securing of food stockpiles, and a growth in the economy. Now, after this video, I highly recommend that you go and watch these two videos by Professor Han Dongping. He grew up during the Cultural Revolution in rural Jimo County, and he gives a perspective of the transformation in the countryside. One video is from the just before the 2010s, I believe, like 2009 or something like that, and he gives his account of the Cultural Revolution and the state of China at the time. And then there's a much more recent video, I believe, from this year, and that's really interesting because he reflects on the impact of Xi and how he's resolved some of the contradictions that were emerging in the 2010s from the reform and opening up. So if we look at the fanaticism now, did Mao support this fanaticism in the Cultural Revolution? Of course, Mao was the original person to empower the Red Guards in the beginning, but he did not support the later actions of some of them. It is, I think, disingenuous to say that Mao encouraged such fanaticism. He even sent in troops to protect these historical sites that were protected under the Guobao when some youths chose to ignore these rules. I do not think that Mao or the Cultural Revolution should be blamed for the injustices or exploitations by opportunists at the time, which obviously were not called for, and Mao did everything in his power to suppress. But to be honest, I don't think that the fanatics in the cities are actually defining of what the Cultural Revolution is, though. It's not essential to it. You could have fanatics doing injustices against people in any movement when power is up for grabs. So what makes the Cultural Revolution in particular? Well, like I said, compared to the other revolutions, of which it was one, the Cultural Revolution was extremely civil and controlled for the most part, compared with like the Russian Revolution, for example. But the Cultural Revolution was, after all, a revolution. It was not supposed to be a dinner party. But in spite of this reality, Mao still made a critique publicly of the CCRG, who later booked up their ideas and would also help to extinguish the fanaticism in 1967. On the 28th of January 1967, Mao's 8-point order specifically gave the PLA the power to maintain order. The whole thing was executed with as much restraint as possible from Mao's perspective, and we mustn't take the position of Western historians that use small details in the grand scale of things to condemn Mao's last 20 years, to condemn the thesis of the necessity of the Cultural Revolution, and even to condemn the glorious personality cult as a whole. This is an unacceptable position. Of course, we will condemn individual violence, but we will not condemn the whole Cultural Revolution. People did things that Mao obviously didn't approve of, but he was hardly stoking this up in any sense at all. In fact, these were the same kind of people who would also disobey orders even when they came straight from Mao and Zhou. On the 1st of September 1967, Zhou Enlai ordered the Red Guard to abandon violence and to stop attacking foreigners. On the 17th of September, he would meet with select groups of Red Guard leaders, and he told them that he had a message from Chairman Mao saying that the revolutionary generals had been making some mistakes. On the 16th of May, the party centre accused plotters of taking advantage of divisions in the violence to spread more violence and anarchy in order to create an environment where the proletarian headquarters of Chairman Mao would be overthrown and the power of the state could be seized by counter-revolutionary forces. This was a direct attack against fanatics, but not against the Cultural Revolution as a whole. You see, think people like Jiang Qing, Kang Sheng, Chen Boda, Yao Wenyuan, etc. were not attacked here. The ultra-left troublemakers were actually counter-revolutionary rightists who were only left in form, but they were right in essence. The removal of the 16th of May elements was carried out nationwide in late 1967. By order of the party, the CCRG and the State Council, the army was called in to support order. All rifles had to be returned, apart from the ones that were in a militia and that kind of thing, and Mao said to stand back and to not interfere with the army's restoration of order. This was the beginning of the attack on the ultra-leftist counter-revolutionaries who were responsible for factional violence in the summer of 1967. In January 1968, schools and universities were all opened again, even in the cities. By spring 1968, the Cultural Revolution was still continuing, as it did until 1976, but it advanced in a civilized way as normal life resumed. In July 1968, Mao himself summoned student leaders for a private audience, and the sending down began. All students had to go up into the mountains and down to the countryside to learn from the peasants and to get out of the over-socialised urban intellectual university environments which would breed disconnect from the material reality of the country, and it creates hipsters. Between 1967 and 1979, 12 million urban youths were sent down to the countryside. 16,470,000 rusticated youth were educated in total, in a great success. Hipsterist tendencies were growing in Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Hangzhou, Nanjing, Wuhan, Chengdu, Chongqing, and they needed to be humbled. The youths needed to be humbled by the masses. So by autumn 1968, this fanaticism was over. The 9th Congress of the Communist Party of China was held in 1969. Now, people erroneously say that this marks the end of the Cultural Revolution. It does not. It continued until 1976. But in this Congress, Mao ratified the purge of Liu and Deng, and he integrated the remaining non-16th of May elements of the CCRG, like Jiang Qing and Kang Sheng, into the Politburo with seats on the Politburo, leading to an overall balanced composure of the Politburo. Liu Shaoqi was permanently expelled from the party, and he would not be restored until after Mao's death, and it was a posthumous restoration. Mao stated his overall satisfaction for how the situation had turned out. A new party constitution was written and approved, and what should especially be noted is that Mao Zedong thought is elevated to the same height as Leninism and Marxism, and is viewed as a third stage of Marxism-Leninism of universal significance not only to the people of China, but to the proletariat of all the world, whilst imperialism was heading towards collapse, and the bourgeoisie seeked to undermine the proletarian parties with revisionism. Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought was seen as the weapon for the whole world's proletariat in defeating revisionism, in preventing the emergence of bureaucracy, and ultimately to do what Stalin could not. Stalin had lost the bureaucracy, so Mao Zedong thought was the way to prevent Khrushchevs from being born. Kang Sheng got onto the Politburo and the Standing Committee, which was now composed of Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Kang Sheng, Lin Biao, and Chen Boda. It's a pretty revolutionary lineup, you could say. The military was never more represented than in this Central Committee lineup. The 9th Congress, like I say, was not an end to the Cultural Revolution, which advanced courageously and correctly and orderly for another 7 more years. To recover the economy, the One Strike, Three Antis campaign was launched to improve the sluggishness and to ensure the end of those tendencies so troublesome in the Great Leap. The idea of the campaign was to strike down embezzlement, profiteering, extravagance and waste. Also, much industry had to be moved to the west, which was extremely expensive, but this was in the case of an imperialist attack on the coast, be it from US or from the Soviet Union, which was a real fear at the time. The economy did pretty well to say it was during a revolution, and the Ida Sanfan went on until 1972. Overall, by the time that Mao had died, the corrupt elements had been removed, a glorious proletarian culture had been forged, and the country's economic base was secured and was beginning to advance. China really was in a pretty good position, and the Cultural Revolution had been a success. Hua Guofeng would have likely maintained the two whatevers as they were called, and he would have maintained the socialism in China, probably without market reforms. The cultural and moral gains would have persisted, and China now would probably have a bit of a different feel to it. Mao's portrait would still be up. People would wear his pin and carry his book. Buildings would be decorated with red and yellow slogans and quotations. It would be interesting, certainly. The proletarian revolutionary culture and aesthetic would have been maintained to whatever Mao had set, whilst the technology and the economy would progress without moral and cultural degradation. It annoys me so much when people say that, some red god tore down this gate or whatever, or smashed up a valuable document or damaged a temple, therefore Mao is evil and against the Chinese culture, and a cultural revolution is not necessary and it should be denounced. This is clearly not what Mao intended, and even when it happened, it was only happening in concentrated areas in the cities, with perhaps about 10% of the whole red guards in the whole country doing this sort of destructive behaviour. And moreover, this was swiftly reined in, and from 1968 to 1976, which was the vast majority of the Cultural Revolution, the Cultural Revolution was not over. It was advancing as Mao had always intended after he sorted out these troublemakers with the PLA. Yes, these incidents are unfortunate, but no, this doesn't make the Cultural Revolution any less true or any less necessary, and it does not make Mao evil. He did everything in his power to stop this, and within 2 years, eventually he did. So, if not fanaticism, what is it that defines the Cultural Revolution? The Cultural Revolution was in fact not a mainly urban phenomenon. That was a small slice of it. Largely, it was a rural phenomenon. The party officials leading rural areas of the countryside prior to the Cultural Revolution were extremely corrupt and abused power. There was an entrenched political culture of landlord rule, and this still persisted in the superstructure of society even after socialism had been established in the base. The educated Marxist intellectuals had become an elitist group, and they looked down upon the masses of uneducated peasants. Many officials oppressed the backwards peasants. Prior to the Cultural Revolution, Mao had attempted to launch individual anti-corruption campaigns, but the problem was that once one guy was removed, another guy would take his place, and the exact same political culture existed. Officials would act like the landlords did before and abuse their power in the name of a party. These two Huangdi equated their own personal authority with the authority of the party, and if it was challenged, they accused the peasants of challenging the rule and ideas of the party, and thus accused them of being counter-revolutionaries. So it was the Cultural Revolution that gave peasants the courage and the justification to challenge their local party bosses. The Cultural Revolution gave articulation to what the peasants knew intuitively, but in a conscious form. Mao's quotations were anything but dystopian and imposed from the top. They resonated from the peasants, and it was embraced from the grassroots against those middle-level officials who were dictatorially, and tyrannically ruling over them. They provided the people with a strong sense of political power. All the village leaders had to be accountable to the words and the slogans of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Now, illiterate peasants, who once were laughed at, could memorise Mao's quotations through song, and they were given personal dignity through the political discourse. No one would dare laugh at them anymore. This is the unknown Cultural Revolution, not an escape from reality or an idealisation, but in fact a way to articulate and to make sense of that deep reality that the peasants themselves intuitively know. So we know that there was problems with the Great Leap, and growth in the countryside was difficult. But you see, it's not as simple as the Great Leap backwards and the cultural devolution, as some smart individuals might try and tell you. Now, grain yields did grow for nearly all the years in the collective period, with the exception of the famine in the late 50s, but then the pre-famine yields were achieved in 1965, and they only grew from there. Of course, we know afterwards, after Mao died, the People's Commune system was scrapped and it was replaced by the Household Responsibility system, which individualised agriculture. As the commune was phased out, investment in agriculture fell off dramatically, and although this is supposed to be a video about the Cultural Revolution, I do want to just mention this because people make it sound like this was a miracle in the countryside, but the reason it gave people more money is because in the commune period you had austerity, and this was removed as production became more individualised. So what it did was it freed up the surplus that would have otherwise been reinvested in collective development, and it gave individual peasant families larger disposable incomes. But the point is that the growth that came after Mao would have never happened if there was no centrally planned economy under Mao. And the only reason that the growth didn't become monopolies and all of this kind of thing is because of the leading role of the party, which maintained nationalisation of some key heavy industries and only let markets deal with light areas. But this decollectivisation was not a miracle. It disempowered the peasants, and the loss of a collective economic interest fragmented their political power. With the end of the communes, the peasants lost a lot of social securities that they had access to, like healthcare, work, etc., that was guaranteed before. The disparity between the urban and rural became huge, and it has not even started to have been dealt with until the era of Xi Jinping. But the point is that in the economy, clearly it did offset the damage of the Great Leap, and grain production arrived at those pre-famine levels by 1965. This was all well and good, and there was now food stockpiles now. Each person received 1 pound of rice a day, and this was more than they could actually consume, so they were able to build up a personal stockpile too. However, although the economy had recovered by 1965, by 1966 a major dilemma had developed in Chinese political life. The Communist Party had been granted, of course, the supreme authority by the Chinese constitution to rule. But without appropriate supervision from the people, the party bosses at all levels possessed the human tendency to become arrogant and corrupt. The corruption of an increasing number of individual party leaders eventually led to corruption of the party as an institution as a whole, from a quantitative change of one leader and then another becoming corrupt, to a qualitative change of the whole party institution becoming corrupt. Because a corrupt institution would not be able to exercise leadership in an effective manner, ultimately this development would lead to its death. This would make everything that everyone fought for in the revolution and the civil war worthless. So this was unacceptable. They could not just stand there and let the party die and be consumed by itself. So during the 1950s and the early 1960s, Mao Zedong had initiated numerous campaigns to try and prevent this from happening. The Cultural Revolution, in fact, was Mao's last resort after the previous campaigns failed to do the job effectively. It differed from all the previous campaigns because, for the first time in the CPC's history, it circumvented those local party bosses, and it stressed the principle of letting the masses empower and educate themselves. And of course this did include allowing them to make their own mistakes, but Mao said, we have to stand back, we have to let the masses make their own mistakes and learn from them themselves. We can't impose this upon them. As I mentioned, the old political culture of the officials was the main cause of the abuse of power in the rural areas. But to be honest with you, it was only part of the problem. The culture of the villagers as well contributed to the problem too. At the very bottom of the Chinese social hierarchy, ordinary villagers had become accustomed to oppression and abuse. Official abuse was normal for them. The submissive culture of the abused was formed over a long period of time, and it was started in the family in the upbringing of children. Rural children often got told the following advice from their parents, that submission ensures a safe life and courage leads to trouble and risk. Villagers did not know the law of the CPC and its internal rules, and they much less knew how to use the law and the CPC rules to fight illegal activities. What villagers saw from experience was that the traditional practice of officials looking after each other had continued. As a result, instead of confronting illegal village party leaders openly, many chose just to accept oppression submissively. Mao's Cultural Revolution tried to overcome this tradition, especially with the four bigs, as it was called. The great area of opinions, great freedom, the big characters posters, and the great debate, even amongst those at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. In fact, one of the very first things that Deng Xiaoping did to re-establish the power of the party and the scholastically educated elite and to further the neoliberal economic principles after Mao had died, was to ban big character posters, which were great thorns in the sides of officials of all stripes throughout the period of the Cultural Revolution. Now let us talk about the end of the Cultural Revolution. We don't usually take stances against specific people unless it's very necessary and everything is absolutely clear. And again, a lot of the individuals we speak about here, the history was written after them when we didn't have a chance to defend themselves. So, we uphold that the Cultural Revolution was necessary and good. We uphold Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong fought, but the opinion of certain individuals, there's a freedom in the party to believe what you wish about them, and we tend to take stances, like we say, against political positions more so. So the first suspicious thing we have at the end of the Cultural Revolution is, of course, the death of Lin Biao. So, it was said that Lin Biao was behind Project 571, and if you don't know what Project 571 was, it was this document that was found which was a plot to assassinate Mao. So, I do think that there's a real possibility that rightists like Deng framed him because they would benefit from Lin's death. And not to mention that the details of the plot are still undercover, and only a tiny summary was given about it from Jiang Zemin's government, which also had an anti-Cultural Revolution opinion ever since the 1980s. The whole Lin Biao coup thing is just so bizarre, because Lin and Mao were very close allies, and they saw eye to eye in almost every issue. And Mao was already in failing health in the 70s. I've heard a theory that the Plan 571 was not Lin Biao's, but his son Lin Guo's. It just seems so unreasonable to try and overthrow Mao, because and Lin would know this, because the whole credibility of the PRC is built on Mao. So even if he managed to kill him, like who the hell would want to follow Lin Biao anymore? If they'd have the masses, Mao was entrenched so much into the society and embraced so much by the masses, they'd have a revolution. Like if Deng tried to take Mao's portrait of Tiananmen, they would have risen. They would have had an armed uprising. But Lin's son is definitely an interesting character, because he was definitely the ringleader anyway in the scheme to assassinate Mao. But he did probably want to put Lin Biao at the head of the government. When this scheme was discovered, maybe Lin had no choice, but even if he didn't want to partake in it, it would incriminate him, so maybe he had no choice but to escape to the Soviet Union with his family. But of course we know he ultimately died when the plane crashed in Mongolia. Now his public fall from grace happened as an aftermath of that escape. Many do believe that Lin Biao was not involved in the attempt to assassinate Chairman Mao, but his family was probably involved in the treacherous act. Lin Biao used to always say that Mao's every word is right and every word is worth, what was it, 1,000 or 10,000 of another person's words. So it just doesn't seem to be right that Lin would be the person to kill Mao. And he was even not prepared to get onto the plane to fly off. He was actually forcefully transferred. And Lin Biao throughout his life was never really showed to be hungry for power. Of course, if Mao died naturally, it probably would have been much better if Lin Biao was alive, and then he would become Chairman Mao's successor. This whole plane incident was very unfortunate, because maybe if not Lin Biao, then Premier Zhou Enlai would be the favourite one. But of course, he died before Mao in history. But the reason that a succession would be best for Lin Biao, because unlike Deng Xiaoping, Lin Biao was actually passionate about Mao Zedong thoughts, and maybe if he was alive, it would have been no prosecution of a gang of four. Maybe Deng Xiaoping wouldn't really have got a succession, and he wouldn't have injected capitalism in a communist vein. Now, in my thinking, Chairman Xi Jinping is trying hard to overcome the wrong policies of Deng Xiaoping, because Xi Jinping understands that all things which glitter are not gold. And he's also trying to overcome corruption in the party and also from China. But I really can't see a coup being advantageous to Lin. The whole army that he led and that he trained was loyal primarily to Mao Zedong thought, not to Lin's character. And the whole nation and its legitimacy operated upon that basis. Any coup would be contrary to the nation's very heart and soul. The only way would be if it was secret and then they could claim that Mao died of natural causes and then become the successor. But this is not usually what is proposed. It just seems extremely out of character. Now I will link this in the description. Here is a document with the actual details of Project 571. Now we can see it only points out that Lin Biao's son, Lin Guo, and the other two unspecified names, but there was never a mention of Lin Biao. It only mentioned that they would like him to succeed and gain more influence against Jiang Chongqiao. So now we'll leave Lin Biao behind for now. It's a very, very mysterious phenomenon. Now, after Lin Biao was out of the picture, we know that the Gang of Four really took his place. And again, we allow free opinion amongst our members about the Gang of Four, specifically so long as they uphold Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and the necessity of a cultural revolution. Now, if we look at the Gang of Four, the criticism only came after the victors had acted against their targets, so that's rather cowardly to start with. But Mao always had supported a balance of ideological and technical experts, and he believed that some of the people purged may have utility in practical fields. Now, you can say this is a risky policy rehabilitating some of these people, but Mao believed that they would be balanced out. So some people say this makes Mao a revisionist at the end of his life. I don't think so. He wasn't rehabilitating Deng Xiaoping so that he could be a capitalist, he just thought he had some useful technical skills. So, for example, Deng Xiaoping was the chief of staff of the People's Liberation Army, and he had essentially taken over Zhou Enlai's activities during his illness, but whilst Mao was still alive, he was unable to consolidate power as Mao denied him the premiership. Now this is around the time of the Criticise Lin Biao, Criticise Confucius campaign. So after the 10th Party Congress in 1973, Chairman Mao made his criticism of Confucius, and important to note, it was not against the things like filial piety, but it was specifically against Confucius' defence of slavery and the denigration of women, which he viewed as hindering China's development by resisting historical progress. The next part of the campaign was led by Jiang Qing. It was more a way to get against, to get at Lin Biao after his death. Later on, under Zhou Enlai, he linked Confucius to the resistance to modernization and better education and made those priorities. In 1975 began what was called the War on Empiricism to criticize Deng Xiaoping, which sidelined the criticism of Confucius. As I mentioned, at this time, Deng was taking on many of Zhou's powers during his illness, and he was acting as premier in Zhou's absence until Deng again was forced out of power in 1976. The criticism, you see, wasn't so much against Confucian moral values or anything like that. It was against Confucianism being used as part of a superstructure to support a slave society and feudalism, and it was believed to be evidence to do so by at the time the recent discoveries of the Stone Age Dawankou culture, and thus began an interpretation of Chinese history as a conflict between the forces of Confucianism and the forces of legalism. And then the CPC attempted to identify themselves as modern legalists, you see. Mao's image was even associated with that of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and he was seen as an anti-Confucian legalist too. Again, both were founders in a way too. So whilst he was alive and he was still holding the political sway, Mao was unwilling to let either the moderates or the radicals have complete control. He wanted a mix of, like I say, ideological and technical experts. He didn't want only ideologists who couldn't do anything technical, but he didn't want just a technical bureaucracy which had no concern for the collective goal. So Mao tried to strike a balance there. In this, Mao appointed a figure he thought would embody this, who was Hua Guofeng, as the premier. As a compromise of sorts between the competing factions, he wasn't going to let Deng Xiaoping get the premiership, you see. Hua's main objective was to synthesize the factions once again, and to have a united party, which I certainly support and I think would have been a good direction, whatever you may think about Hua Guofeng, the Gang of Four, all that sort of thing. After Mao had died, Deng and his supporters became more aggressive in 1978, pushing for a further denigration of Mao's stature, which Hua had maintained. As you see, Hua still had Mao's portrait. He still had red banners, red flags, slogans, loyalty dancers, pins, Mao's red book. All of the cultural things of the Cultural Revolution continued. But Deng was trying to push for the abolition of that. And he also pushed for the demotion of several Politburo members who were associated with keeping Deng under control whilst Mao was alive. Deng went on to hollow out the Politburo of those who supported Hua Guofeng, and he began to openly condemn the Cultural Revolution. In 1978, Peng Dehuai and Liu Shaoqi were posthumously rehabilitated, and then criticism of Mao and the Cultural Revolution increased, which was actually as well a way to attack Hua Guofeng, because he was the last remaining leader of the Cultural Revolution, and he had maintained that the aesthetic and the rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution. Eventually, Hua Guofeng lost the premiership to Zhao Ziyang in 1980, but he remained party chairman. In 1982, the post of chairman was abolished, and Hua lost his Politburo seat. This is when we can say that the Maoist era had in reality come to an end with the fall of Hua. After the end of the Cultural Revolution, the things that Mao feared started to come about again. So what we saw is that the students in the cities became a separate class, as they ceased to be able to exist independently of the social institution which was their universities. Suddenly their class interests ceased to be united with that of the working class, and it becomes entangled instead with their institution in the city. Their interest becomes the cancerous perpetuation, growth, and empowerment of the institution that employs them and provides for them and supports their lifestyle. One of the genius moments of Mao Zedong was the identification of his tendency amongst bureaucrats, managers, intelligentsia, and even some party officials. He observed that the stale and rigid bureaucracy of the Soviet Union, which Stalin had tried and failed to fight, and which had borne Khrushchev and revisionism, and he saw the intellectual arrogance of the Soviet Union's university intellectuals. And he saw that in these institutions, if they become divorced from the working class, Western liberal counterculture ideas arise. He was determined never to let China go this way. The start of the Cultural Revolution was indeed violent. From 1966 to 1968, many universities did not open. The battle was won for China's future. The rightists wanted a developing country like China to have a highly trained managerial elite, professional administrators, specialists and experts. Mao wanted none of this. Well, he wanted highly trained experts, but certainly he wanted no kind of an elite. In the universities, the conflict was physically violent, and education came to a halt, more or less, for 2 years. Finally, Mao's concept of a working class, non-elitist education won out, and when the schools returned, things were quite different from 1968 for the rest of the Cultural Revolution. So it is incorrect to say that once the violence had subsided, the Cultural Revolution was over. In fact, only then did these revolutionary and pioneering ideas begin to be implemented. Ideas such as mental work being superior to physical work were uprooted, and education was made non-competitive. All exams were either abolished or made open book, because it was deemed that if you could find and apply the knowledge from a book in a timely manner, you could do this at your work anyway, in your career. And it was considered more useful for a student to be able to find the information he needed quickly, and that would be more useful for him in the future than just to cram for an exam and forget all of that information when it came to him actually doing his job. There were enormous changes from classical Chinese education. Humble factory workers were brought into teaching many of the practical subjects. Workshops were set up within schools themselves and involved students of production, which had to be of the same standard of that of a factory. Millions of youth in China learnt technical skills, as well as theoretical skills in this way, as well as industrial discipline before ever leaving school. All children in every year of school had to work full-time for 2 months in some industry. They also had 8 weeks holiday off a year. The jobs that they could do on their industrial placements each year were varied, from shipbuilding to jade-carding. Concerning higher education, not every child went to university, in fact only a minority did. There were, however, no fees, all books were, and food and accommodation was provided freely. Before getting a place in university, every applicant must have already participated in a factory or a field for a minimum of 2 years already. There were no entrance examinations during the Cultural Revolution, but a student was chosen not only because of his intellectual capability, but because his colleagues in an election had ranked him as most likely to use his education to serve the people. In the Cultural Revolution, the main idea in education that was to shape new minds in China that would have a different mentality was that a competitive society must of necessity develop a philosophy of individualism, whereas a society based upon cooperation will develop quite a different ethic. Thus, being at university is not about following your personal impulses, or going there to express your personality or whatever bourgeois notions we might have about university today. Rather, a man's knowledge and creativity were not his own possessions, but were to be used for the benefit of all. Things changed even for the teachers. Professors were required to also complete manual labour, and were often humbled from their arrogant positions previously. Many stopped signing their names on their work after witnessing the workers never taking personal glory in their products. Professors were happy to make closer friendships with students instead of being cold and distant, and they no longer resented it if students were also learning about certain processes rather than solely from their professors in the classroom. Here we see that the Cultural Revolution was breaking down the barriers between these groups. All students also had to serve in the civilian militia. There were also voluntary extracurricular centres to learn things like gardening, embroidery, calligraphy, literature, model making, and musical instruments, gymnastics, etc. This was provided free of charge. The Cultural Revolution turned so many old educational ideas upside down in order to forge the spirit of a new society and a new kind of man. Though indeed initially violent and very experimental, it was this that I believe that prevented China from going the way of the Khrushchevite revisionists, and it was for this reason that there was nothing like the hipsters on Tiananmen under Mao. Especially the mandatory service in labour in a field or a factory for 2 to 3 years in order to be able to get to university in the first instance greatly diminished the effects of over-socialised, institutionally bound and dependent urbanites, and it made for much more humble people coming back to work in the factories or in the government after they had finished their time at university. I strongly agree with Mao's policy, and even for the most technical and research-based degrees, having students have to go to the countryside or a factory for 2 or 3 years in order to even graduate is extremely important, or else you get hipster university intellectuals on Tiananmen willing to kill for Nike shoes. Just look at this video here.
Does our generation have anything? We don't have the goals our parents had. We don't have the fanatical idealism our older brothers and sisters once had. So what do we want? Nike shoes. Lots of free time to take our girlfriends to a bar. The freedom to discuss an issue with someone. And to get a little respect from society.
At one point, the clash with the police was so intense that people could have been trampled to death. I was almost crushed in the crowd. But it was obvious that the police were not ordered to beat people up. They only tried to form a human blockade.
Look at these twerps. I want Nike shoes. This is such a stark example of what ending the Cultural Revolution had created. Mao had ensured that these students in cities did not become a separate class of labour aristocrats, and he had united their work and their sentiment with that of the peasants and the workers. If you don't, this is the result of over-socialised hipsters milling around in the city. I think it's clear enough to see the great benefits of the Cultural Revolution. I wish Chairman Xi Jinping all the best in restoring morality in China, in addressing these contradictions arising from the reform and opening up, and for reinstating a socialist, revolutionary, proletarian culture and the prominence of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. Thank you ever so much for watching, comrades. It's been a long video, but it is a topic of crucial importance for all who go under the banner of Mao, and we must do all we can to defend the legacy of the Cultural Revolution from its attacks both in China and in the West. Thank you all for watching again, and farewell. 心中的太阳是毛泽东啊，他领导我们奋勇向前进啊，无产阶级江山一呀一片红，咿呀一自由嘿，呀儿呀自由啊，人民翻身当家做主人。教我的奴隶，起来，全世界受苦的